This summer, we overhauled our behavior modification plan for our school. We needed to do it because we had been getting into a rut. We had started catching ourselves being surprised and caught off guard when our kids misbehaved. We said things like, "Wait a minute, these are fourth graders. They should know how to behave by now." Which is kind of like saying, "Hey, these are fourth graders. They should know trigonometry by now." No, you don't come out knowing how to make good choices. Humans have a terrible tendency to make bad choices. And so we had to come up with a behavior modification plan that accounted for the fact that our students were going to make bad choices. We needed to not be surprised by that, but to plan for it. We have a plan for how to teach them math, so we needed a plan for what to do when they make bad choices. One of the reasons that we need a plan in our school and in our lives is because the people that we love, even the ones very close to us, are going to make bad choices. And some of them are going to change the course of our lives. What the younger son did in today's story changed the course of his family's life. He was the only one in the driver's seat, but his father and his brother were completely affected by it. This story is about us, and it's about our families. So we need to find our place in it. On the surface, the son, the younger son who went off, he's the sinner. He's the problem. He's the one who made the bad choice that hurt everyone. And the father and the brother are the victims of his choice. But with a closer look, we can see that everybody in this story had their own choices to make. No one loses the choices that they have to make because of someone else's choices. So we are being called to find where we are in this story about the older son and the younger son and the father. A lot of us are the younger son. Maybe when you heard this story, you thought, "Guilty, that's me." But you know what the younger son is? If he's not you, he's someone else in your family. You're not very far from the younger son, because the younger son is an addict. He's someone who doesn't have any ability to delay gratification, and he doesn't control his impulses well. So he sees an opportunity and he takes it, even though to do it blows up his relationship with his father, destroys the family business, and then he goes off with the money. He goes on a bender and he spends it all, wastes it, and he hits rock bottom. And this story goes through a lot of trouble to tell us what his rock bottom was and how disgraceful it was. But when he's at rock bottom, he doesn't stay there. Can you relate to the younger son? Does he remind you of yourself or anyone else in your life? Others of us relate to the father. The father is someone who has been hurt by someone who was supposed to love him. The father is experiencing a complete different change in the course of his life. because of something he had no control over. He didn't cause his son's addiction. He couldn't control it, and he couldn't cure it. But he did have control over his own response to his son. Can you relate to the Father? Has someone in your life made a choice that changed the course of your life and you had no control over it? A lot of us relate to the older son. In fact, I would say that probably the older son is the one that we can relate to as a group, maybe the best. You know why I know that? Because you just heard this story in church. We're churchgoers, you and me. We go to church. We do the right thing. We take our spiritual growth seriously. Religious people are the most likely to be like the older son. And the way that you know that you are relating to the older son is if when you hear this story, it gets your hackles up a little bit. When I hear this story, it gets my hackles up a little bit. Maybe like me, there's been times in your life where you've said, well, of course the older son is upset. He did everything right, and what did it get him? A lot of us are working really hard to follow the commandments and do the right thing. And it's natural that it would bother us when other people haven't. But we are being invited to consider that no matter who we are in this story, the younger son who's messed up and is ashamed, the father who's been hurt and has to deal with it, the older son who did everything right and is watching the people who didn't. No matter where we are, we're being introduced to the idea that no one can take away our choices. No matter what happens, we can respond however we choose. No one can take away our ability to respond. And in this story, there is one person who is being held up to us as the example of what not to do. And surprise, surprise, it's not the younger son. The younger son is not an example of what not to do because he owned what he did. He blew it. He was an addict. But that's not a surprise. Addiction is an epidemic. And so when he gets to rock bottom, instead of staying there or self-pitying or making excuses, he owns it and he goes back and he apologizes. He's an example of what we should do. And the father is not a bad example to us. The father's a good example because when his son hurt him and changed the course of his life, he didn't beg him to stay. He didn't chase after him and beg him, don't go. And he didn't have some big melodramatic middle scene where he went to the faraway country and begged for him to come home. He didn't send him extra money because he was worried. But while he was home, he did his work. He did his inner work. So when the son came back, he was ready to welcome him. The person we are being cautioned to not be like is the older son. Because the older son was bitter over someone else's choices. The older son didn't regret what he did. He regretted what his brother did. And it made him bitter. He did what we call putting your thermostat in someone else's room. When his brother turned up the heat, he was the one who was sweating. And we're not supposed to do that. His brother's business was his business. But this older son was not prepared at all for his brother to make a bad choice. And that's why we had to change our behavior modification plan at the school, because we kept being surprised when our students would make a bad choice. And we need to not be surprised. We need to plan for it. We need to plan that they're not going to come to us knowing math, and they're not going to come to us necessarily knowing how to make good choices. It's part of what we plan for. And the gospel says that when we make a bad choice and then we repent the way the younger son did, the angels throw a party in heaven. And so actually that's what we're doing now with our behavior modification plan. When our students do something good, when they make a good choice, we throw a party. And when they make a bad choice, we have a plan. James Taylor told us, people are going to hurt you. They're going to desert you. They'll take your soul if you let them, older son. But don't you let them. God is not surprised when we mess up. God plans for it. So we need to make sure that we do not let other people's choices control our lives. Don't ever put your thermostat in someone else's room.